You love somebody and they treated you like garbage. You counted on them for safety, and what you got instead was abuse. And that can follow you for the rest of your life. So how do you move on from the ghosts of your past that are haunting you? Mended Light.
So what is emotional abuse, emotional trauma? What does it look like? I mean, I know it can take a lot of different forms.
Well, some people think that physical abuse is more serious, but the fact is, in some cases, you can bounce back from that a lot easier than ongoing psychological, spiritual, or emotional abuse and trauma.
Well, so in the book, The Body Keeps the Score, which is an excellent research-based book on basically every type of trauma, it's exceptional. But if that's a little bit heavy, because it's kind of long too, Dr. Vanderkolk, is that his name? Bessel van der Kolk, he talks about how emotional trauma is just as devastating as physical and sexual abuse. And it can be even more so. Yeah. And I think the reason why it can be even more so is it's very easy to point to, bruises or sexual abuse or anything like that and say, they hit me, it was wrong. Yeah. They took advantage of me, it was wrong. It was not consensual, and everybody will agree that that was wrong. Yeah. But you try and explain what gaslighting or narcissism or any of that looks like.
It's abstract.
Yeah, it's so abstract, and people go, well, maybe that's not what they intended. Or maybe that didn't really happen that way, or that's just your perspective.
If I hit you or you hit me, there's something concrete that was wrong, that was harmful. Whereas if it's psychological or emotional, there's different angles you can approach it from, and there's different ways of seeing it. But here's how I look at it. If I'm physically abused, assaulted, or sexually abused, there's physical trauma and pain that inevitably doesn't last, right? The bruises heal, there may be scars, but ultimately the physical pain comes and goes. But in those situations, I felt demeaned, I felt afraid, even terrified. I felt humiliated and shamed. I was terrified for my safety. There was self-loathing, there was guilt. I mean, these are not saying all of these all the time, but there's all sorts of stuff that's mixed up in a physical or a sexual assault. And those things continue. Those things go on. And those exact same effects follow emotional abuse. Yeah. So you could say, I never laid a hand on her, or I never touched him, but you could destroy somebody just as bad. Right. Because the lasting effects are the same as if you had.
Well, and you talk about the need that everybody has to be loved and respected. Yeah. It was still the using of a person. Yeah. It was still, I'm not seen, I'm not heard, I'm not understood, I'm not me.
Yeah. Well, and it's important that we're having this type of conversation about what it's like for the person who was abused, because so often we blame the victim and we circle the wagons around the abuser. And I do think it's important to have empathy for people, period. I do think people who do terrible things, by and large, do it from a very human place of
hurt people.
Yeah, like that.
Like they've been hurt.
They've been hurt, or they're hurting, or they're, in relationships, a lot of people who are manipulative, they're trying to achieve, I think we all want safety, respect, and love. Yeah. And a lot of our worst behaviors come from trying to get safety, respect, and love, or in response to feeling that we don't have safety, respect, and love. And a lot of emotional abuse comes from someone who is just trying to feel like, I am loved. Yeah. That doesn't make it any less damaging or awful. And so while we can have compassion for the abuser and see their humanity, that should never be our first priority. That should never be where we focus. And far too often, the person who was abused, we minimize their experience. Far too often, we blame them for being on the receiving end of something because we think of the abuser as a good person and, they wouldn't act like that unless you made them, unless you brought that out of them. And if I'm an abuse victim, very often I'm led to believe that myself. Well, I fell in love with this person because of their goodness, so if they're treating me this way, it's because of me.
So often the person experiencing abuse internalizes it. Yeah. And whether other people say that to them, those things to them or not, which they very well could, that is how they feel. Yeah. And they internalize it as something must be wrong with me. Right. I must be part of the problem. Yeah. And going back to what you were saying, that the first priority, even the person who perpetrates the abuse, like, we can see that it came from a very human place.
Yeah.
That is still not the first priority. Speaking to that, like, so often that is a coping mechanism for someone who was in their own unhealthy environment, right?
Yeah.
Quite often from childhood, right? And so these are the coping mechanisms that were created in their childhood. And I can absolutely speak to that in my previous marriages. Like, I could see how their unhealthy coping mechanisms that were showing up in our marriage came from their lack of security, came from their lack of love. Yeah. In their childhood, and it is the way that they survived. But that does not mean that it was okay for it to continue to play out, in our home, in our marriage, and with our kids.
Well, can you speak to then the idea, because a lot of people, they stay because they do see it. They see this is abusive, and they see this came from, patterns that they learned in childhood, and, there's compassion there, but then they stay because, I can't leave them now. Like, yes, what they're doing is wrong, and yes, what they're doing is abusive, but they need me. How are they ever going to heal and get better if I leave? And something that I admire about you is you don't put up with people's bullshit. Yeah. No, but one thing I admire about you is you know how you will and won't be treated.
Yeah. Well, and so first off, like, deciding whether to end a relationship, and I think it matters if it's a marriage relationship, versus
a dating
relationship, right? But only you can make that decision. Only you can decide what's best for you. And if there's children involved, and I've been in that situation, the perspective, sometimes erroneously, is that it's always best for the child to stay together, right? And I wouldn't say that that's a hard, fast rule. Actually, I would say the opposite. Like, you need to evaluate the dynamics that are going on and what's really best for the child. And for me, I had come to the conclusion that I needed to be the best version of me for my child, and that I didn't feel like I could do that in that relationship. Yeah. And to some extent, if I stayed, even if I vocalized what wasn't okay, about the relationship dynamics, even if I verbally, talked about those things and said those things when it was age appropriate, to some extent, I was always accepting my former spouse's behavior by staying.
And you're modeling that for the kids.
And I was accepting, and I was setting that example for my child. And that was one of the biggest reasons. So I needed to be the best version of me, and I didn't feel like I could do that in that relationship. And I wanted my child to have a different example of what was acceptable, what wasn't acceptable. And so that's the choice I made. But everybody has different factors that go into it. And you just need to make sure that you're evaluating that for your needs, if there's children involved, for their needs. And so here's the biggest thing that I would say, when it comes to any sort of challenge, because, back to growth opportunities, relationships are nothing but growth opportunities, right? Like, we're trying to come together and create these beautiful relationships, these beautiful, long-lasting families. And it's going to come with challenges, like, it's going to come with mountains to climb. And so just because there are challenges there, because of past traumas or because of personalities or whatever they are, that's not like, oh, cut and run, there's a problem. But it has to be a problem for both of you, right? Yeah. Like, if I'm in a committed relationship and there are behavior patterns that are not healthy or even abusive, I can be aware of the fact that that's a problem for me, but is it truly a problem for my partner? Because if it's not truly a problem for my partner, it's not really a problem, and it is not going to change.
Yeah. Well, and an aspect of this is if your partner is aware of it and they're working on it, you determine how much is too much or when you stay. Because the fact is, I became a couples therapist because things can get better for some couples. Because some people do identify and they make the changes and they're glad they worked it out. And other people, they hear those success stories and they stay together longer than maybe they should have because they had hope. And every case, every circumstance is different. The biggest thing that I would say is that everyone's behavior is their own responsibility, right? Yeah. You're responsible for you. Your partner has to be responsible for them, and staying because you can't leave them now because you can see, like, the fact is, almost everybody who is abusive is also human. Almost everybody, I mean, they're all technically human beings, but I mean, there's good things about them. There's beautiful, wonderful things about them that you see and that you appreciate and that you stay for. But if they're not responsible for them, it's not about what they're like at their best. It's about what they're like at their worst. And you have to look out for your own emotional and mental well-being. Because if you don't do it, you can't rely on them to. So how do you overcome it? Frankly, if you've experienced a trauma, we believe that you could use the help of somebody who is trained to guide you through healing from trauma. There's a whole process, so much more than we could ever cover in one YouTube video.
Or 10.
Or 10. But there's a whole process for reclaiming who you were. And so often people feel like when they've experienced a trauma, they lose themselves.
Right.
Right? And so you need the guidance of that. You need the support of people who love you. And most importantly, you need to know, who do I want to be? What do I want my life to look like? And what steps do I need to take to march towards that?
Well, and even figuring that out is a journey. Like, it's not it's just taking the first step.
Yeah, it's not you have to know it now and then go for it. Yeah.
Yeah. And the biggest thing when it comes to healing from trauma is being in a safe place, because you experience the traumatic event and then you've experienced subsequent triggers, for how long? I mean, I've met with people for 60, 70 years, right? Like, they experienced severe trauma as a child and they're in their 60s and 70s. They've experienced the triggers and the re-traumatization. And so they've spent most of their life living in those trauma triggers. But recognizing that you're in a safe place, like first recognizing you experienced the trauma, recognizing that you're now in a safe place to heal. And that's usually when it all comes up, when your life is going well, and you might even think, like, why is this happening now? Why am I breaking down? I've lived through, these horrible experiences, and now I'm breaking down when my life is finally good and safe. And it's because your body knows and your mind knows that it's safe and it needs to be addressed. And having the support to then do that in a healthy way.
If you've experienced an emotional trauma, what are you doing to cope with it? What's been helpful for you? Let us know in the comments below. What would you like us to address in one of these Married to a Therapist videos? Let us know in the comments below. Next, what are you doing right now? Oh, you're watching another one of our videos? That's a good choice.
How do you talk to your kids about dating after divorce?
We're going to take you step by step through it. Check that action out. Until next time, keep shining. We need your light. And here comes the video.
Check it out.